Okay, on this lesson, we're going to be looking at complex numbers in the quadratic formula. So if you remember, complex numbers have a real part and an imaginary part. So remember the square root of a negative number, we bring it on the outside and put an I. Also remember I squared equals a negative 1, so you'll substitute that in. So complex numbers are very similar to variables. So example 1, what we're going to do is we're going to multiply and then we'll add like terms. So notice this first set of parentheses is really not needed because there's just a 1 in front. I am going to distribute that 2 though, so that's going to be 16 plus 6i. And then I'm combining like terms. So the real parts, so the parts without the I, so that's going to be 22. And then the imaginary parts, which is the part with the I, would be negative 2i. And just like a variable x, we don't do anything with that. We just leave it as an I there. So there's our answer. Okay, so example 2, we're going to be, notice we have a binomial times a binomial, so we need to use FOIL. So we'll multiply, that's 50 plus 60i minus 5i minus 6i squared. So we're going to combine like terms, and also remember we said at the beginning I squared equals a negative 1, so that's really negative 6 times a negative 1, which will make that plus 6. So we're going to be combining those two real parts, so that's going to be 56, and then combining the imaginary parts, that will be 55i. So there's our answer. So make sure you remember I squared equals negative 1. Always substitute that in at the end. Okay, so looking at number 3, this one says we're going to be squaring it, which means we'll multiply it by itself. So write it twice. And it's very similar to what we just did in the last one. We're going to have to use FOIL. So 6 times 6 is 36 plus 30i plus 30i, and then 5i times 5i is 25i squared. So remember I squared is negative 1, so that will end up making that negative 25 there. So 36 minus 25 would give us 11, and then combining the i's in the middle would make 60i. Okay, so those are complex numbers, and now we're going to get into the quadratic formula. So remember, quadratic formula is another way to solve a quadratic equation. A quadratic equation has x squared in it. So your first step is to set the equation equal to 0. Then you can find your a, b, and c, and you can plug into this formula. So if you look at example 4, first thing is to set it equal to 0. So I'm going to subtract 2x on both sides. That gives me x squared plus 6x plus 10 equals 0. And then I'm going to plug into the quadratic formula. So remember, a is the number in front of x squared. So a equals 1. B is the number in front of x, so that equals 6. And c is your constant, which is the number without the variable. So we're going to plug into that quadratic formula right here. So x equals, it says negative b, so that makes it negative 6 because b is positive, plus or minus the square root of b squared, so 6 squared, minus 4 times a times c over 2 times a. Okay, so once we plug into the quadratic formula, you want to only type in the stuff that's under the square root. So this stuff here, let me highlight. So only that part without the square root, you're plugging that into the calculator. So when you plug it into the calculator, you get a negative 4. So you have the square root of negative 4 over 2. Okay, so we just went over complex numbers with i's. So anytime I have a square root that has a negative under it, I'm going to rewrite it with an I on the outside and then take the square root of that positive number. 4 happens to be a perfect square. So square root of 4 equals 2. So I should have 2i there and then over 2. Now at the end, you need to check and see if you can divide all of the numbers by the same thing, which you can. You can divide all of them by a 2. So that's negative 3 plus or minus 1i over 1, which is not really needed. So at the end, just check and see if you can simplify further. Okay, so we're going to look at example 5. So first step is to set it equal to 0. Notice it's already there. So I'm going to plug in a is the number in front of x squared, b is the number in front of x, c is your constant. So plugging into the formula, it's negative b, so that's negative 5, plus or minus the square root of b squared minus 4 times a times c all over 2 times a. Okay, so we're going to plug in what's under the square root only without the square root. And you should get 121. So 121 is a perfect square. It equals 11. So I'm going to have negative 5 plus or minus 11 over 6. Now, we don't have an I here because there was not a negative under the square root. The last one we did because it had a negative. So now I'm going to add and subtract these numbers. Negative 5 plus 11 divided by 6. So that's 6 over 6, which equals 1. And then negative 5 minus 11 over 6, which is a negative 16 over 6. You're welcome to reduce the fraction, which would be negative 8 over 3. So we get 2 answers. So if it is a perfect square and it's just a number without an I, we can actually add and subtract it. So make sure you go another step. Okay, we're going to stop there. So this is using the quadratic formula to solve a quadratic equation. If you have any questions, please let me know.